Born in 1945, Neil Young would go on to become one of the most notable names of the folk/country rock genre. First as a member of the band Buffalo Springfield in the late 60s, before going on to carve out his own solo career. Alongside his increasing renown in the realm of music, there was a burgeoning activism, which is probably best exemplified by his environmentalism. Though I think he's probably best known to younger audiences due to his demand to have his music removed from Spotify due to his disagreement with the views on COVID being aired on the Joe Rogan Experience. But I think my favorite fact about him is that he was sued by his own record label for making music. In 1982, Neil Young moved over to Geffen Records. Not surprising for a record label to want a very popular artist under their contract, but unfortunately for them, this happened to coincide with his experimental era. The first album that he would record under Geffen would be Trance, a Kraftwerk-inspired album with electronic infusion. A pretty far cry from a folk or country rock sound, I think we can agree. This was soon followed up by Everybody's Rocking, an album with a more rockabilly style. Closer in genre than the previous, but still pretty off from what he had established himself with. The subsequent poor reception that these two albums received prompted Geffen Records to sue Young for releasing music that isn't commercial and musically uncharacteristic of his previous recordings. This would be subsequently settled by Young countersuing due to assurances in his contract that he would have creative freedom, and so the matter was dropped. But I do think it's a pretty interesting anecdote regarding the relationship between the creative and the corporate structure behind them. Anyway, Final Fantasy VII was rather popular, wasn't it? To this day, it remains the highest-selling single-player game in the franchise, selling more than 14 million units, and is responsible for the massive surge in the popularity of the series in the West. Now, of course, with popularity comes milking of content, and this would lead to the creation of the Final Fantasy VII compilation, a mass of interweaving media relating to the original game that has now manifested itself in subsequent games, books, anime, and a film, which is what I wish to speak about today. Now, those who watched my 15 video might remember that I said I would be taking a break from Final Fantasy. But there is a reason that I am lying about that. Unfortunately, I have become someone who uses Twitter daily. I really wish I could go back 5 years before I became like this, but I happen to have a mental illness that makes me hate myself, and so I subject myself to such kinds of punishment. And thanks to that, I haven't been able to avoid the noise regarding the second part of a certain remake. So it's kind of on the brain. But I don't want to seem so uncreative, so we will be talking about Advent Children. And to further show that this isn't just desperately attempting to grab onto the algorithm, I do actually have something to say about it. I have a pretty ambivalent attitude towards Advent Children. As with many people, Final Fantasy VII was my introduction to the franchise. I didn't really play it that much. I got like 30 minutes to an hour to become aware of it. It was actually either Final Fantasy V or Tactics Advance that was the first that I played intently, and 4 was the first that I finished, which is now ironically one of my least favourite. But it would be wrong of me to say that 7 didn't plant the seed. And despite only finishing it for the first time a lot later in my life, I did still play it a lot throughout my teens. So, thanks to that, I absolutely loved the movie upon seeing it. As a source of fan service, no, not that kind, it ticked just about every box. But as I've gotten older and have become more pretentiously analytical, I find it to be a bit disappointing. And this video is about why. So, let's start where one usually does with these things. Advent Children takes place 2 years after the events of the game, where we see Midgar in the process of being rebuilt. But before we see that, we are shown the northern crater and hear people doing something in there. These people turning out to be the Turks. But something goes wrong and we see a helicopter escaping. We then cut to Midgar to see these attempts of rebuilding. Well, there's actually something else first, but we'll talk about that later. We also see, alongside this rebuild, that there is a sickness spreading throughout the people living in the city, called geostigma. One that we will soon discover is believed to be caused by the exposure to the live stream which broke from the planet to end the crisis 2 years prior. And I just want to stop here already to say that I really like this premise. Firstly, the choice to focus on the rebuild needed afterward, acknowledging that despite the planet being saved at the end of the game, there was still a lot of damage to repair, and that their society would also need to adapt to living a different way than before. With the fact that this is 2 years later, and they are still facing these difficulties, kind of emphasizing that. But also the fact that there are consequences. Humanity had a role in the crisis of Final Fantasy VII. Like, obviously, they aren't responsible for the existence of a nihilistic, malicious entity which destroys worlds, but a significant part of that crisis is due to the exploitation of the planet, and despite it being damaged, it was the thing that actually ended the crisis. So, it's important that there is some consequence or trade-off for humanity, or else we wouldn't really have expected them to make a change to how their society functions. We as humans don't tend to alter our behaviors if they don't have negative outcomes for ourselves. Anyway, following the crisis, Tifa has returned to running her bar, while also seemingly being the hub for Cloud's delivery service. Cloud himself has been absent for a long time, and Tifa is only able to get hold of him via voicemail to tell him that Reno is looking for him. He acknowledges this request and goes on to meet Rufus, who asks for his help due to signs of Genova resurfacing, particularly with the appearance of 3 remnants, but he refuses. Another good piece of characterization. Cloud has good reason to distrust Rufus. He was the president of a company which clamped its authoritarian rule upon the world. It is pretty understandable to believe his reasons may be malicious. I mean, he needs the money. How else would he be able to afford all his belts? Also, he's very clearly being sly and manipulative here. But let's press on. This is the synopsis, not the analysis section. With the Genova Jamboree now unleashed, they head to Midgar, where they gather up the children infected with geostigma to take them to the Forgotten City to audition for the next Kingdom Hearts. At the city, Kadaj, the leader of the group, convinces the children to drink from the water that he has befouled, and so gets them enslaved? Sorry, I couldn't really think of a better word. Cloud attempts to rescue them but fails, and needs to be rescued by Vincent. Kadaj's cretins then return to Midgar, as they are still on the hunt for Genova's remains. A search which results in them summoning Bahamut, and so needing the party to defeat it. Kadaj finally does get hold of Genova, and manifests into Sephiroth, requiring Cloud to defeat him, and then they make use of the live stream beneath the church to cure the geostigma. A rather abrupt ending there, but that kind of speaks to one of my problems with the film. After doing a lot of good work setting up a pretty interesting premise and conflict, it then decides to dedicate the next hour to extended action scenes. But before becoming too much of a moaning Mitchell, let's talk about the things I like. I know I have said previously that I don't give Square Enix points for graphical fidelity anymore. And I don't really, but I do find it pretty impressive how this still holds up. It does have a bit of an issue of the murky filter that was an ever-present of the 7th gen of gaming, but it really does still look good. Not just graphically though, the animation is smooth and fluid, and the choreography for the fight scenes are great. The highlight obviously being the Sephiroth fight, but I especially like the fight in the church between Tifa and Loz. And I also generally like the new character designs. Advent Children does definitely have my favourite Tifa design. To wrap up the presentation of our film, we have a brilliant soundtrack. The soundtrack for Advent Children was worked on by members of the Black Mages, and the result is some great arrangements of tracks from the game, as well as the new ones as well. I wish I could give more of a peek of the soundtrack, but for some reason, Square Enix is far more grabby over music from their films compared to their games. So, the technical aspects have been nailed, as usual. What else? This was going to be an interesting one to see, since we wouldn't be starting from scratch. Most of the characters we are going to see in this film are people whose personalities we already know and who we have formed opinions of. Now, this does create the temptation for a writer to be a bit lazy and just keep characters the same with no development. But fortunately, that doesn't happen here. For the most part, characters that have been established prior have developed further, or at least are generally wrapped to fit around their circumstances. And we even have our deuteragonist and protagonist work off of each other. Cloud is characterized well as someone struggling to grasp with now having to actually shape his own identity, while suffering with guilt from Aerith's death, his failure to help Denzel, and the fact that he's also hiding that he's afflicted with geostigma. I do feel like sometimes he's a bit too mopey, but that is where Tifa comes in. She's the supportive character one would have expected from before, generally internalizing her problems so that she can focus on being a crutch for those around her. But this time, she does actually air her grievances for a change. Her frustrations building up enough to tell Cloud off for being too self-engrossed. An outburst not something we would really see from her unless it's a chance to throw out slurs. Moving on to the non-party characters, Rufus is still sly, manipulative and deceptive. But he's also got a bit of a cattiness to him now that makes me like him more. But most notably, Rude and Reno are around again to be the comic relief, and they accomplish their task with aplomb. The scenes with them are genuinely some of the most enjoyable, as they do a great job of balancing their ability to be cool and calm and overconfident, whilst also being goofy idiots. You almost forget they aided and abetted a brutal authoritarian corporation which waged wars and murdered thousands just to protect capital. I'm just joking. I do genuinely love Rude and Reno. And I also think our antagonists are well characterized. It's pretty well laid out that they are essentially child versions of Sephiroth, and that is displayed well. They show clear immaturity and childishness, and seemingly are very incapable of doing anything without running off to mumsy. And I also like this small bit here. They are the children of Genova, so it would make sense that they show revulsion to the things associated with Aerith and the Ancients. However, there is one point where the characterization isn't great, and that's with the rest of the party members from the game. And that's mainly because they don't really get enough screen time. Though, there are some things we can determine. Yuffie is still full of herself and bratty. Sid seems more positive and friendly. And Kate Sith is still annoying. On the note of the party, that allows me to awkwardly segue to the next topic. Why doesn't Vincent have a phone? He used to be a Turk and is often doing info gathering and espionage things. You would think that if anyone had like a communication device, it would be him. Any movie which continues from or spins off of an established property is going to have nods to that property. This is a good thing to do, rewarding the fan base who are generally going to be the main audience. But it does also have some pitfalls. Notably, the risk of embracing in so much self-indulgence that it actually detracts from the plot. And Advent Children avoids this trap. Mostly. The movie has many nods and references to Final Fantasy VII, and some to the series generally. But they are implemented smoothly, being clear references to those who know of them, but not damaging to the narrative to those who don't. Let's quickly list some, starting with what for me is one of the best. In the fight with Loz, Tifa mixes her limit breaks within her attack, facilitating a well choreographed and animated scene, while also referencing the game. Cloud also uses his limit breaks throughout. In the same fight, we also have Loz's ringtone being the series' battle victory music. We also have some of the party members wearing ribbons, a Moogle plushie, a reference to Yuffie's motion sickness, Barrett being bad with handling materia, Nanakai actually using materia, and on that note, an acknowledgement of how much materia the party would have gathered throughout their adventures. I also like the fact that Kadaj doesn't need equipment to handle materia. I mean, it makes sense. They are beings created from Genova's infestation of the lifestream. So they wouldn't need an artificial means of interacting with it. Clearly though, no one has ever showed Marlene how to use materia. And then of course, we also have the use of the ending of Final Fantasy VII as the intro to the film. Again, these are things that fit naturally into events and exposition, not causing confusion for those who wouldn't know about it, but adding something extra for those who do. But I did use the word mostly, didn't I? I suppose I need to explain that qualifier.
The life stream. That's what we call the river of life that circles our planet, giving life to the world and everything in it.
Who is this for? This segment plays just after the intro of the Turks in the Northern Crater, and features Marlene very quickly running through the events of Final Fantasy VII. So, I've answered my question then, haven't I? It's for people who didn't play the game, and it's providing them with the backstory that is needed to watch the movie. Except, there is a bit of a problem with that. This little wrap-up is really limited and reductive, to the point that if you don't know the plot of Final Fantasy VII, you won't be able to follow this movie just off of it. So, the second point would be to serve as a reminder to jog the memory of those who did play it and just need to be refreshed on some topics heading into the film. And yes, I accept that this is what it's for. But that also belies my issue. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children is a fan movie. You can see it from this already 6 minutes into the film, but even more so by the fact that throughout the first 30 to 40 minutes, we have the setting up of some great intrigue and mystery, but then they just decide the reason for all of this is previously established entities. And I just find it quite frustrating. As I've just said, the first 30 minutes set up some great opportunities to craft a concern over a new threat, having to negotiate a new crisis which exists as a consequence of past actions. But instead, it was just, oh, it's Sephiroth again. And for me, this has two issues. Firstly, it's just uncreative and results in the media just revolving on itself. I'm not saying that you couldn't use threads from the game to base your plot off of. I like the idea of Genova leaving a mark within the livestream as a kind of stain that remains and recycles torment as a routine punishment for past sins. And I even kind of like the thing of Kadaj being a remnant of Sephiroth, and so being insecure and erratic as he feels inferior and desperate for his mother's approval. But instead, it just reverted to basically being more of the game. And aside from just feeling uncreative, this safe approach of going for established things actually makes me more critical of some of the plot points and the way it's ham-fisted to put these things in. Like, I feel that geostigma is kind of pointless. Like, when I think about it, I don't really see what it's for. It's made clear that it's something created by Genova, but then I feel like even the plot kind of changes what it's there for. We are first told that it's needed for the reunion, which is fine and vague. Then it's implied that it allows those infected to be used as puppets to assist the remnants to find Genova for the reunion. And this is also a plot point I have an issue with. Law states that they need to look everywhere related to Shinra. And since that's basically everywhere in Gaia, you could understand why they may wish to elicit some help for it. But that's kind of undermined by the fact that they routinely just pop over to have chats with the president of Shinra. Ask him, torture him. I mean, he literally stands up and is holding Genova. You didn't think to just lift up his fucking robe? Also, if the geostigma is there to create neophytes to serve Genova, then why does it kill people? That feels a bit counterproductive. And it all seems pretty useless since Kadaj can just carry out the reunion by rubbing Genova's fluids on his chest like it's Vicks Vapor Rub. Also, why Sephiroth? I mean, it's clearly implied that Genova is still guiding all of this. So, why is she choosing Sephiroth to be reborn? He's lost twice now. Maybe he's not the best equipped to do the job you want him to? But anyway, Sephiroth then claims the stigma is supposed to kill its host so that their corrupted bodies join the livestream to corrode the planet. And it's just it all just gives the vibe that they knew they wanted to end with a Sephiroth fight, and so the limited plot scenes on the way are just there to justify that happening. And limited is a key word. Just like Kingsglaive, Advent Children becomes infested with fight scenes, particularly around the end. And while the movie does have some genuinely brilliant ones, some are just overlong and tedious. I mean, the Bahamut fight is actually pretty bad. It's just the party twatting it occasionally until Cloud arrives to kill it with one slash. Why do they do this focus shot on Tifa? She literally doesn't do anything here. And then afterwards, we have an overly long bike chase. What is it with Final Fantasy VII and bike chases? Which I would really dislike if it wasn't for the occasional popping up of Rude and Reno to add some levity. And it really annoys me to be so down on it after having such an intriguing opening. Cards on the table. I am not at all surprised that the movie came out like this. Given the limitations of the PS1, it was to be expected that with the better technology, they would jump at the chance to give the intended grandeur they had wished initially. And let me also make it clear that I don't have an issue with a fan film. Sometimes it's great to just indulge in entertainment with characters in a world that you already know to enjoy. It's just that for me, Advent Children is emblematic of a problem that is represented in the Final Fantasy VII compilation. Something that I like to call the franchise trap. This film feels like a victim of its franchise. And by that, I don't mean Final Fantasy. I mean the franchise that is Final Fantasy VII. The success of the base game, and the subsequent release of all the additional media around it, has transformed it into a franchise in its own right. And they genuinely bear a noticeable similarity. Most of them are based around the same event or tie in to the same specific characters. And this is the franchise trap, a situation whereby the media produced within is discouraged from deviating greatly from established canon and characters. This is obviously quite often done due to companies themselves realizing they have created something they can siphon money from, but there are also occasions where this reluctance to experiment is created by fans not wanting the property to deviate from the features that got them into it in the first place. Just look at the reaction that the Final Fantasy VII Remake received for firstly making a change to the combat, and then after release the possibility of the plot being different going forward. Granted, this was supposed to be a remake, and so there is higher scrutiny to changes, but you can easily find situations where fans have reacted poorly to attempted deviations within a franchise. And I just think it's something to take note of. We are currently in a time where the industry generally does struggle to come up with new ideas, with sequels and remasters being the modus operandi of the industry. So I don't think we should be discouraging things that are aiming to be a bit more unique. And it doesn't even need to be vastly unique. Just to get back to the subject of the video, I think that the lore and world present in the Final Fantasy VII compilation leaves more than enough space to create new stories out of, if you really don't want to jump too much from your comfort zone. And we know that it can be done. Ironically, the Final Fantasy franchise at large has had a good track record of varying up its formula, despite outcry from its fanbase. So, while there is nothing wrong with sometimes wallowing in a nice squishy comfort zone, we should also make sure to keep encouraging some innovation as well. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. This is part of a new series I'm going to be starting, contrasting the Final Fantasy VII compilation with another thing which I'm not going to reveal just yet. And of course there will be other stuff in between.